What is the difference in repotting a mature bonsai compared to growing stock? Hey, this is Jelle, growing bonsai, and we're in the middle of February. As a result, my Prunus mume is flowering and the first maples are starting to push their buds. This is for me the time for the bulk of repotting. And in this video I'm going to repot a few trees. Now if you're repotting, it depends a little on which stage your tree is in, what you're going to do. We have a fairly mature bonsai here. I'm going to improve the Nebari a little bit and I'm going to change the angle in the pot. Then I have a Katsura maple here, which is in a nursery container, organic substrate. I'm going to show you how I transfer this into a more open substrate to grow out over the next years. Then there's a small cutting. I worked on this tree last year. This only had a few roots. I'm going to look at how the roots have developed. And here is my little princess Japanese maple, which I worked on in a small video last year as well. I am going to warn you, it is a little bit of a chaotic video. I have taped a part of the repotting videos already and then I realized I've never done a video on the different repotting styles for different phases of a bonsai. A little leaf lilac tree. This lilac tree, you can tell, the buds, they're swelling. The tree has started to grow for the season. It is only the middle of February, but hey, the tree tells it is time to repot. Last year the pot wasn't draining all that well. I didn't get as much growth as I wanted and a few smaller branches have died off over last season. For me, all of these things are signs this needs to be repotted. This tree is well established, it has a very well ramified crown and the root ball has solidified. Unfortunately, the Nebari is not very good, so I'm going to really tease the roots upwards, making sure that the surface roots get a better chance to develop. But I'm not going to comb out the whole root ball, I'm going to give it a little bit less space than I would on young developing stock. Now, as always, first thing to do, tilt the tree, look underneath the pot and see the wires that holding the tree in place and cut them off. Making sure that the ends are nice and loose from the sides and the holes. Check, there's usually more than one wire. Now with a bit of luck I can just lift it out of the pot by tapping the pot slightly and holding the tree up. Easy peasy. Now the root ball, you can tell, very nice and compact. It is all fine feeder roots here on the outside, but the whole pot has been completely filled, which explains why the tree was not growing all that fast anymore. Now I'm first going to remove all the wires here from the root ball and then I'm going to check the old pot, see whether there's still gauze that needs to be removed or mesh from the holes. Now one of the mesh is missing. Besides that, the pot is nice and clean and I can just reuse it as it is. That is nice and easy. Let's take a look here. There we go. It just pulled the mesh out of the pot when I was putting it. And the way that you attach a piece of mesh to the pot is by using a little bit of a butterfly or glasses, if you will. Basically, you make a little loop and you put one end of the wire at a perpendicular angle to the main wire and you do the same thing on the other side, where say I make a little loop and you bring the end of the wire up. Naturally, the distance between these two pieces of wire that stick up now need to be small enough to fit through the hole, but not so small that it can't connect. So you can just gently make it a little bit bigger if it doesn't, and now it has roughly the size of the hole. Then this you push through the mesh that you want to connect to the pot. And then you just put the two ends through the pot, flip the pot around and you just bend the ends outward. They don't need to be all that long. And this will pretty much hold the mesh in place while you're working on the tree, and later on the substrate will also push it down. So that's why I don't think it's very critical. Next step, of course, in preparing the pot is putting a new wire here through the holes. For this I'm using 1.5 or 2 millimeters aluminium. Take one piece of wire and you say this is one hole, bend it, one hole and a second hole, and now it has the size that it needs to just go through these tie down holes through the pot. Flip the pot around, you fold the wire over and it's in place. Now if you look at this root ball, and as you can tell I have a little pot sitting underneath it, makes it easier to work because everything will just fall down here in the container. These are all very nice fine roots, right? It is a shame, but this is all going to be removed. Now I have a few approaches that I could take. I'm looking now at the root ball and I see that the whole outside has similarly thick roots. So I'm going to take the lazy approach to repotting. I'm just going to gently cut off the outside 2 or 3 centimeters all around. What this does, that all the circling roots are now removed from the root ball. Hook I can gently scrape off the old moss here, clean that trunk and gently clean out the edges of these roots. This way I open up the root ball. The roots are sticking out a little bit and therefore they are more easily penetrating the new substrate, and I can put new substrate in between here, which will make sure that the roots actually grow into new substrate. Hard edges like this can give rise to problems with your roots, because the roots do not like to grow from one medium to the next. Whereas if the ends are now already in the new medium, after the repotting, they will grow inwards much easier. There's a few things that you might notice. This side of the trunk was buried up to here, and you see that it actually continues. There's one little root that comes up that I can just clip off. But besides that, this is a nice continuation of the root ball, and actually here in the back there's another root that goes to the side. Then on this side you have one very high root. Unfortunately I don't see a lot of low roots that can take over, so I can't just remove this. But by planting it a little bit at an angle compared to how it was, you can see this is how it was. It's a tiny little bit at an angle. This will be buried a little bit deeper, and this will be a little bit more free in the pot. So what that means is that I'll have to clip off a little bit of the surface roots here, so that if it comes up, it doesn't stick out of the soil. And at the same time, on the other side, I need to remove a little bit at the bottom. See how flat the root base is? This is the bottom of the pot. This is the bottom of the trunk. Edges nice and clean, but not too smooth, so that new substrate can fit in between. And in the core of the root ball I've not done anything, as this is a tree that is quite well established, growing homogeneously, and I don't want to disturb that. And as said, I want to slant it a little bit to the left compared to how it was. I move a bit of the substrate to the left. I want to slant it to the right, so I move some substrate to the left so it is up a little bit, and then I gently squeeze it down. Roots now here are very nice close to the left. Still I want it at this slant. And now the nice thing, because I didn't remove all that much from the root ball, I can here just use the wires and tie it directly on the roots. With a chopstick, pre-drill a root here a little bit underneath the roots. Take the wire, push it through. This will reduce the visibility of the wire later on. Comes up here. Now I can just tightly wire it into the pot. And now with the tree safely attached to the pot, I can just add substrate all along the perimeter. Gently bring it into place. And then I take a chopstick and I start poking into the original root ball and slightly underneath. That way, helping new substrate in between the roots, creating a nice firm connection with the root ball. I'm going to water it down. What you can tell here is the pot is filled up to the rim with new substrate. 2 reasons. Here the root ball was tilted up, and I really wanted to cover the whole root ball. But more importantly, over the next 2 or 3 weeks, I expect the tree to settle in the pot a little bit more. The substrate will compact a little bit more, and then I'll have a ½ centimeter, ¼ inch space between the rim of the pot and the substrate. When you are repotting, try to avoid the trap of piling the soil very high because the roots don't fit in the pot. It only leads to erosion. Then the upper roots will dry out, making that the lower roots are even more important than the upper roots, and therefore the next repotting, again, you can't put it down. It's much better to take a pot that is a little bit higher, then you get new surface roots, and then you can start pruning the bottom of the root ball, and you can sink the tree much lower at the next repotting. This is a Japanese maple of the variety Shishikashira, also known as the lion's head maple. Last year I repotted it, and it was not stable in the pot because it is only rooted on one side. It was cutting grown, given to me by a dear friend, so this is a tree that I find important. Interestingly, some of the comments hinted at me repotting this in fall was not such a great idea. Well, we're now 1.5 years down the road. As you can see, the tree is still happy, healthy and alive. Well, let's take a look. As said last year in the video, it was rooted on one side, which was one of the reasons for repotting in fall, to get more roots as the tree goes dormant. At that time, all the nutrients from the foliage are withdrawn into the tree, and there is a great relocation of nutrients in the plant. This causes growth of the trunk, but also the roots develop quite substantially. Then I let it grow for the whole season, not doing much at all. And now we are at the start of the season again. The buds are swelling. It is a little bit early to repot, but as said, it's the start of the bulk repotting for me. Remove the wire here and there, and take the tree out of the pot. Now we look at that. This is a nice compact root ball, very shallow, stable, healthy. Great. And now I can slowly, with a root hook or a chopstick, try to tease the root ball apart, which is quite easy because this one still doesn't have a lot of main roots and therefore the root ball is still open. But look at that. There's some new growth at the root tips. This tree is waking up from winter, ready to go for spring. To ease the repotting, I'm just going to cut those off. What this does is it stimulates roots further on the inside to grow. This of course is good to stimulate also the trunk to grow new roots. So now we have cleaned this up a little bit. I'm in a little bit of an awkward position. What we now can tell here, there's roots pretty much all around. There's only roots missing here, a corner, and there's roots missing here in the corner. But besides that, the root ball is now nice and even. This is in part because of hard root pruning. If you look at a root ball like this, it is quite wide, right? But if I now go in and I say no, I want to make it a lot narrower. Let's do that. Now I've removed a lot of the fine root mass, and I do the same here at the bottom. By doing this, the tree really needs to invest in root mass now. So on top of the earlier, I now also removed a handful of the very fine feeder roots. These are actually the ones that contribute to nutrients and water. Now because I'm not pruning here the top, and I'm just pruning this lower part, the tree has an excess of buds in comparison to the roots. So as soon as it starts growing, it signals the roots, of course, start growing, it's spring, but there are not a lot of roots to respond. So at that same time that these roots all start growing, also here from the trunk, more and more roots will sprout. This does of course require that the trunk is buried quite substantially. That is why if you look at my trees in development, you hardly ever can see the Nebari. It's always buried quite deeply to facilitate new roots to form within the area of the Nebari. It is very nice and flat and shallow. That's what I'm after. You don't need to clean out everything initially. It does help though if you do, because then you can look at roots and say, where are they intertwined? Here you have a root going underneath the root ball. There we go. This should of course be removed. I'm going to just reuse this pot. And in the previous video I also indicated this is a luxury pot for a tree in this development stage. But that is because the tree was a gift and I want it to look nice. Also when my friends pop by. So I'm just going to put some wire in, you know the drill, right? Then add a little bit of substrate to the bottom of the pot. Put the plant in. Wire it down. Not too tight, but tight enough so it doesn't topple over when there's a wind gust. And then I'll fill it up with substrate. And with a chopstick I'll fix everything in place. Just like that. Now it is important that if you are growing it out for a proper root base, that you don't press down too hard, because then these roots, they will come up to the sides. There's people who use tricks and they'll put a stone underneath it to create a better Nebari. I find that it's not necessary as long as you make sure you compact the soil a little bit. It's quite nice and flat and compact. Then you put your tree on, slide the side roots down a little bit in the substrate, and then you just wire it down as normal. Then the tree roots won't come up, it will stay in place, and you have nothing to worry about. Of course, with little roots, few roots, it is always a little bit awkward to wire it in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to not just wire it in one spot. So I'm creating here a little bit of a square. I'm wiring each wire with the next in the pot. So as you can tell, each wire now goes to the next wire around the tree, connects there, goes around, and then connects with the first wire. This way all the roots are covered. As you can tell, it is not very stable, but it is enough so the tree doesn't just blow over. It does wiggle a little bit. Now I'm just going to add the substrate. There's not really a need to wiggle anything between the roots because the root ball is quite shallow. Now, this all being done, it's a matter of watering and putting this back in the place where it was earlier on and letting it grow for the season again. Now, this little princess has been outside in the garden for the whole of the winter. I worked on this last year, did a little video, and now I can just prune back a few of these branches, but I'm not going to prune back all that much because I actually want this one to grow out a little bit bigger. However, here, these long branches on the base, I don't want to extend. I want a little bit of openness in here as well. Not the thick one, just the thin one. And this side branch can go. And thin this here a little bit as well. Just like that. This I'm going to let grow out. It's a sacrifice branch, just aiding in developing the trunk. But let's look at the roots. You can see it is in a very, very organic substrate here on the top. I did that to encourage surface roots to survive. Now if I remove all this, you can see that the Nebari is actually quite nice. Here you can see the roots have come up into the organic matter, which is really, really good. That means that the surface roots were able to develop more. When repotting, always check the bottom of the pot. Normally there's wires at the bottom holding the plant in place. The root ball is completely coherent. Basically, the roots have filled the pot, not so much that the plant can't stay in for another season. It could, but I want to develop the Nebari better, so I am going to work this plant every year for the next 2 or 3 years. Basically, the first 5 years of developing a bonsai is also looking at the Nebari. Now what I did last year, I put a mesh at the bottom of the pot to prevent the substrate from falling through. And this mesh I can of course use again this year, right? It's just plastic mesh. So back in the pot, it's going to go into the same pot again. I am just doing this to prune back the main roots. This way you get a nice and even root spread. I don't want deep roots, I want surface roots, and I want a nice spread. Now you can see here, this in comparison to the first tree, the cutting that I did, that there's a lot more roots already. It's a lot more stable in the pot, and therefore your Nebari starts to develop. Let me clean this out completely, because in this case I'm still developing the root ball, so I want to see what's happening. So I'm removing all the substrate. Now you see this is a very nice root ball. Lots and lots of small roots, a reasonable root spread here, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to trim back the bottom half here of all these roots, and I'm going to shorten them all in length. And what I do initially, I can just reduce the length. As all these roots are quite nice and evenly grown, I can just reduce it all the way around like this. I'm not going to do it here because I want to keep this substrate, but let me just do that and be right back with you. Once I've done that, I'm going to flip it around, the root ball, and I'm going to look at everything that grows down here. And you can see here this, you can just prune back all these downward growing roots. So now that this is done, you see I have a very small root ball left, which is quite stable. It just sits on the table like this. Here at the bottom I've made it completely flat and I've tried to go as deep as I dare. But if you now look at it, you see that the root ball is really dark. And the darkness is caused by organic matter. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove part of this organic matter, as far as it's still there, by just taking the root hook and I'm sliding it gently between these roots. This does two things. On the one hand, as said, it removes everything here on the inside that is dark and black. This is still from the original potting soil, I think, or from the soil that I used to cover it up. But at the same time, it also displays any roots that are intertwined. And hopefully I pull them out this way, so that I get rid of any intertwined roots. Now here there's a root that is going pretty much across the root ball. This is the time to correct it, to go in and you clip it off. This way now this root is actually allowed to come outward more. So once completely around, and what I do then, I go in here, and you see already I've done it a little bit, and I go in with my scissors and I trim back all the roots that really come from the core all the way up to the base of my tree. Now for planting up, I'm using the same pot that it was in before. I've added some 1.5mm copper wires here in the pot so I can tie down the tree. Taking some of this old substrate, put it as a base in the pot. Make a little bit of a mound here, and the mound will help to push substrate here in the core of this root ball. So now if I just put it gently on top of this mound and rotate it in place, the base of the tree is completely connected to the substrate. Then of course I need to pay attention that I put it up in the angle that I really want the tree to be in later on. Some of these roots might have pushed up a little bit, and now I can just gently take my wire and lay it over the roots. This also is still a fairly young root ball, so here I'm not going to put a lot of pressure. I'm just folding the wire over the roots. This is enough to hold it in place for the next couple of weeks, and in a couple of weeks it will have rooted by itself. Now it is back in place and I can start filling it up. Keep in mind, we removed a lot of substrate from in between the roots, so I'm now going to gently open up space between the roots and work some of the substrate in between these fine roots. Because the substrate is wet, it doesn't fall in all that easily, but that's okay. The main aim is here to make sure there's substrate everywhere between the roots and there's no big open air pockets. And with that, this tree is done. I'll water it and then I'll put it back into the garden and it's ready for the rest of the year. This Katsura is of course not big enough for me. I want this to grow out quite substantially, so I'm not pruning this at all, and therefore I'm going to take it out of this pot. I want the Nebari of course to develop, I want surface roots to develop, and I don't want the vertical roots to develop, so I want to put it in a pot that grows wide rather than high. This might however be the best shape for fast growth. But I'm going to go and put it in this pot. And this pot, patent pending, a 3-point tie down. So the tree is going to be planted in here, and I use 3 wires to hold it in place in the pot. And I've got one stabilizer that I go and put around the trunk. But first, get it out of the pot. Remove the old substrate. It is planted in a very loose organic substrate. I think most of it is actually semi-composed bark. So it should come off quite easily. Removing the old soil, it really is a matter of, and I like to put it on a pot, gently teasing at the roots. Substrate will fall away. You can see here white tips on the roots. These roots have started to grow again after winter. This is a nice time to repot. You also see it here at the leaves. The leaves are coming out of the buds. Now, as you are removing the substrate, gently rotate the plant. And I like to go from the bottom, work my way up, and at the same time at the top just slide off the soft substrate that's here on top. But gently you're trying to tease the roots loose. Not break it, but really see whether the substrate wants to come off between the roots. That way you get an intact root ball, but without substrate. What was that? This is a walnut starting to root. Now what we can recognize here, this used to be another pot. Here you can see the edge of the old pot still buried in the substrate. And this is quite high up, right? So what they did, they propagated this probably by cutting. Then they planted the cutting, probably rooted, in another pot with very, very organic material. And once the tree got established and started growing strongly, they moved it up in a bigger pot and filled that up with bark. But here it is more peat-based substrate, which is here in the core of the root ball. Now it's important at this stage that you get this out. This is going to stay wet a lot longer than the rest of the root ball, and getting this out as much as possible now will save you a lot of problems later on. If you're doing it now, when the tree still has a lot of growing to do, there's a lot of hope that this will not cause a lot of problems long term. If however you leave this in, you grow the plant out for 5 years, and then you do this and you need to remove all this, 5 years of work might be wasted if the tree dies, and you can't actually work on the Nebari at this stage. I'm not a fan of washing out the roots. I know some people do, and you could. I just don't like it. It gets too wet, it gets too clumpy. I just take off what comes off, and in later repotting more will come out if needed. Now as I'm working here the roots, a few things become apparent. Here you see there's a root coming up. This is not going to help us at all, so this is going to go. Here's another one coming up. Also going to go, and the same for this one. This has really reduced the root ball now, right? So this much has come off in one go. Furthermore, if I start looking at the inside of this root ball, you see here big roots that really grow down or even to the inside. So here I can clip this one off. I don't want something that grows into the root ball. And here this downward growing root I'm also going to clip off. If I take these out, again a large part of the root ball has been removed. Now it is important for me, I look at these roots. These are all surface roots, right? These are all attached here to the trunk. They grow along the surface, and some of them are really long. These I want to keep, but everything that grows below that is actually roots that grow downward. So I'm going to be quite radical and just clip them off. This is all gone. And I'll do the same at the other side of the root ball. Here I look, is there anything big that grows down? No, not really. Here there are some roots. There's a strange root growing here, sideways across the trunk line. And I'm going to remove that. This is tricky because I don't know what's connected. It could be quite a lot. I take it and I pull it out. Again, quite a lot of roots. Then I'm left here with a whole lump of roots that really are growing downwards and not part of the surface roots. Also this is all gone. Now if I look at the root ball, it has been reduced to something that is quite open, to be honest, with hardly any roots growing vertical, and most of these roots I could spread out in a more or less horizontal fashion. I've created a little mound here of substrate, so I can just gently find a spot, slide the roots sideways, outwards, over. And let's see whether I can skewer this big wire down. Yes. And now using the 3-point tie down, I can find a spot like here where I'm never going to use the trunk this far up, and wire it down here in place with these 3 wires. I can gently look at the roots again. The roots that are too long, that really would fall over the edge of the pot, like these, I can trim down a little bit. So I'm not going to loop them around to make sure they fit. I'm just going to cut them to size so they fit the width of the container. Particularly the first couple of centimeters here, I find it important to make sure they're not intertwined, so that later on when I prune the roots back, they're all nice and evenly spread without strange curves or connections. A root like this that comes up, of course, can go. And it's really important that you have no roots that are growing around the main trunk. And if you can't untangle them, clip them off. And then they'll grow new side roots. Naturally, after doing this work, you really need to water the tree well. It has been almost 2 weeks since I repotted this and this tree. And you can see here the foliage is starting to extend, and here actually the buds are starting to get visible, and I'm going to very soon start pruning out the buds to keep them nice and compact. This maple, same story. It was repotted 2 weeks ago, and you can see the buds have continued to grow and swell, and very soon the buds will open completely. And basically that's all there is to it. I'm going to continue repotting. It is, after all, early spring. I wish you a good growing season. Keep growing bonsai. Remember, subscribe, like, leave me a comment. If you don't know when to repot your bonsai, this might be a video for you. Well, I guess that was all for now. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.